So our first speaker is Alexis Marshall, who is a double major in journalism and Spanish with a minor in Arabic. She's going to graduate in May 2019, so that's just a few weeks from now. One interesting fact about her, she writes, I've had a local radio feature story about Middle Point landfill air nationally through American Public Media on the Marketplace Morning Report. Her thesis title is Surviving, a journalistic podcast digging deeper into stories of domestic violence and exploring life beyond abuse. And her thesis advisor was Leon Allagood. So let's welcome Alexis.
Hey there. I'm super excited to share my podcast and a little bit about my thesis project with y'all. So just to get started, kind of the format of the thesis, I did 3 episodes, and the point of this podcast was to expose people to more stories of domestic violence, because it's something that I found in my research is vastly undercovered in news media. But it was also supposed to speak to the different experiences of domestic violence survivors and all of the different types of people that domestic violence affects. So the format of the podcast was to speak with different survivors who maybe didn't just suffer from physical abuse, which is what you usually see in news coverage. And maybe it wasn't just between intimate partners, or it wasn't between straight partners. So I was trying to show stories that break down stereotypes about domestic violence and show that it can happen to anyone, and it manifests itself in a lot of different ways. So you might be wondering, why is that important? And I'm kind of getting into right here the basis for this whole project and why I felt it was important to embark on. First off, like I mentioned earlier, there's insufficient coverage of domestic violence in news media. What I found in my research was that domestic violence is really disproportionately undercovered in comparison to other violent crime. And there are a few different reasons for that. Domestic violence is really personal. It's not something that people want to talk about because it's uncomfortable, it's very private. So that makes it really difficult to do news stories about, because we're all about having names and dates and verifying all the facts. That's not something that people want to talk about. So that's one of the contributing factors for its undercoverage. And another reason is because it's super common. So a statistic that gets thrown around a lot, and based on my research, is about 1 in 4 women and about 1 in 5 men is affected by domestic violence over the course of their lifetimes. So super common, and if newspapers reported on every single instance of domestic violence that there was, that would be the whole newspaper. It would be overwhelming. So maybe it can't be covered every single case. But with that being said, even in comparison to other violent crime, it is undercovered. The next problem that I found before I started this project was that it's misrepresented. So if you think about the stories that you see a lot of times in the news about domestic violence, it's often between a straight romantic couple. It's usually male on female violence, and it's almost always physical. Another thing that I found in my research is that the type of stuff that gets reported on is really extreme cases. So in about half of the cases of domestic violence that were covered in this study, the victim ended up dying. And that's really not representative of what happens in domestic violence. That's usually not the outcome, but it is what usually gets covered. So that warps the public's understanding of domestic violence. And that brings me to my third point here, which is that representation matters because it affects everybody in here's perception. The news is supposed to be a reflection of our reality. something that I've learned, like coming up in our journalism department, is to really adhere to the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics. And part of that is that we are supposed to seek the truth and report it. And that's because we know that what we report affects how every single person that consumes that news thinks about the world. So with all of that in mind, it was really important to me that I start showing the more broad experiences of domestic violence survivors, the way that it manifests, and how these people live afterwards. A lot of times in media coverage, we get like a very episodic idea of how domestic violence works. We get like kind of one incident, and we don't really get to the broader patterns of domestic violence, the societal contributing factors. So it was really important to me that I kind of take a broad look and then do individual stories to kind of give voices to people that aren't usually heard. During the process of making this podcast, I had a few limitations. I was going to school full-time at the same time that I was working on all of this, enrolled in no less than 17 hours at any given time while I was working on it. Another issue is I had limited access to equipment. I don't have a radio studio in my home, as much as I wish I did. And I also am a student, so that affects how seriously national organizations are going to take me when I'm going to like reach out to them for comment or try to get them to give me a full 20 or 30-minute interview, because they have CNN and ABC and NPR all reaching out to them for slots as well. So that affects how much national input I was able to have for this. But I did have amazing success getting access to sources here in Middle Tennessee. So I was able to speak with the Domestic Violence Program of Rutherford County, a representative from Bridges Domestic Violence Center in Franklin. I was able to work with the Legal Aid Society of Middle Tennessee, and they were able to connect me to a survivor. I was able to speak with their executive director and really get a lot of different perspectives on domestic violence and how it affects both the survivor and then other organizations that help provide resources to help get people out. So I'm about to show you guys a little, like, basically teaser for the full season, which I'm hosting on a website that I built myself as part of the project. But going forward with this, I really hope to take it to a job and be able to pursue it as one of my beats, as some of like my enterprise stories. It's something that I feel passionately about as a news person and as a person who has a responsibility to inform the public. This is something that I don't think that we're informed enough about. So I look forward to taking it with me after graduation and working on it for hopefully a really long time. And we will just listen to episode 0.
Hey there, I'm Alexis Marshall, and you're listening to Surviving, a podcast shedding light on the often untold stories of domestic violence and exploring life beyond abuse. Right off the bat, there's something you may be wondering. Why make a podcast like this? Well, let me tell you. Domestic violence is underrepresented in American media, and when it does appear, often it's misrepresented. It's frequently shown in the context of a straight romantic relationship with a male aggressor and female victim. It's also almost exclusively portrayed as physical abuse, and usually severe. But that's not an accurate representation of domestic violence. In this pilot season, we're meeting 3 survivors who don't fit those stereotypes, and better demonstrate the broad range of experiences and people whose lives are impacted by abuse. We'll hear about their stories, struggles, and roads to recovery. Coming up on this season of Surviving.
It was great. We were going good, and then we decided that we were going to move in with each other, and we did. And then about a month into that, everything kind of just started out of control.
Threatening me, saying that if I did leave them, that I never see the end of it, that they knew where I lived.
So I was definitely pulled around by my hair, called words, those type of things. Very controlled, very isolated, not able to do certain things.
We are really, really close, and we kind of tell each other everything, and I was lying to them the whole time, so that was really hard for me.
I've been told, oh, well, you're a guy, so that can't happen. I've been told that I'm weak because it happened. I've been told that it's not my fault. I've been told that it was my fault.
It actually surprised me at how upset people that really care about you actually will get the fact that you didn't tell them anything and they had no idea.
I mean, it's been a very hard, very long road, and it's nowhere near done, but we'll see what happens.
There was something greater for me, even though I was going through what I was going through. I knew that I was a conqueror and I'm a cycle breaker, so I really leaned into my own belief of myself, and that's what got me out.
We'll hear all that and so much more coming up on this season of Surviving. Follow Surviving Podcast on Twitter or email survivingpodcast@gmail.com to send questions, comments, and ideas for future episodes. I hope you'll tune in. Until next time, I'm Alexis Marshall, and this is Surviving.
One last thing that I wanted to mention, the hugest thanks go out to the survivors that were willing to interview with me for this project. That was not easy for them, and it was certainly not easy for them to open up to me about some of the most traumatic things that have ever happened to them after knowing me for less than half an hour. So huge thanks go out to them, and I've had a lot of support throughout this project. Lots of thanks are due to my thesis advisor, a lot of my good friends on campus, and the people who inspired me to look into this topic in the first place. But with all of that being said, do you guys have any questions? Yeah?
So earlier you said that news is supposed to be a reflection of reality. That seems to be a very, wonderfully idealistic notion. And I don't deal very much with the news because I feel like it's very sensationalist, that it's not exactly a representation of what actually happens. People tell the stories that they think will sell the most. Do you think that the news media that we have is a reflection of reality, or because of this, where you see it's underrepresented or misrepresented, do you think it's not? And if so, how would you go about changing that if you think it can change?
Yeah, so as it is right now, I don't think that the news is a reflection of reality. I think that there is a lot of sensationalism, and it is idealistic, but that is part of my code of ethics, and the code of ethics for all of the graduates graduating from this program is that what we want to do as news practitioners is be truth tellers and storytellers. I think that moving forward, a big part of that could be a push for nonprofit news organizations. I interned at Nashville Public Radio, which is a nonprofit news organization, and they've done a lot of good work recently that has sparked a lot of change, but they make sure to separate themselves. They aren't advocates, they're truth tellers. And if some positive change happens as a result of that truth, then they've done their jobs well. But it's not their responsibility to move in one direction or another. It is their job to explain what is going on and let people do what they will with that information.
Yeah. What kind of questions did you ask the survivors? How did you get them to open up to you to tell their stories?
So a big part of it is warming people up and letting them know that, first off, if they at any time need to pause or take a moment to collect themselves, that's totally okay. With some of my interviewees, I made sure to ask if they feel more comfortable with the term victim or survivor, because there are different connotations that go with each of those titles. And then otherwise, it was just letting them know, I'm a person, you're a person, and and kind of moving from there. It doesn't have to be this weird like power dynamic. We're just two people. I'm asking questions, and if at any time like you need to stop or you don't feel comfortable answering something, that's totally okay. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah.
What's something I should really listen to these? Maybe I'll find this in there, but what's something you found from somebody on the outside who's not in one of these relationships, but somebody who might know somebody in an abusive relationship, or a way to address that and be able to deal with it?
That's not directly addressed, I guess. The survivors have like advice, but I didn't really get to talk to somebody who was kind of survivor adjacent to give advice there. What I know is that people are going to get help when they're ready to get help. And judgment and telling people like, you should do this, you have to do this, takes away choice. So finding resources has to be the victim or the survivor's choice, but you can always be a support. You can always give access to resources, but it should never be forced, because it's all about kind of giving somebody a way out as opposed to forcing them in the direction, because a whole big part of abuse is that it's a cycle of power and control. And even if you're trying to help, you exerting power and control over that person is still not empowering them to seek help. It's forcing them perhaps in a direction that they aren't ready to go yet. Mm-hmm.
What was the most difficult part of this project for you?
There were a lot of them. It was, I think a lot of it came in the research portion. I read through a lot of statistics that made it very clear exactly how common abuse is. And it was really difficult to spend like hours and hours, night after night, just poring over data that showed like the numbers of how horrible people could be to each other. And that definitely took a lot out of me. And after I did kind of the data portion of everything, I needed a few days to kind of go away from it and eat a lot of donuts and take a lot of naps. So I think looking at the raw numbers of just like how common it is and how little we see of it, and how infrequently we see access to resources to help people get out. Mm-hmm.
How long did you work on this project?
The thesis proposal was last semester, but I started getting interviews in October, I believe, was when I had my first interview. And I kept getting interviews through February. And I actually have like another source up in Nashville that is willing to interview, and he and I might be meeting up like after graduation to get his story on the record. So it's ongoing, but started back in October was with the actual interview portion. Yeah.
Do you have any like advice or tips on how to get started on like your research?
For like a podcast or for a thesis?
For a thesis.
Start early and do it often, and yeah, just stay on top of it. And once you find like a few good resources or papers, like look back through their bibliographies and works cited pages, and then go and look up those, because there's always like work that came before the work that you find the first time, and you want to find the most, you want to find like the data behind the source. So if you see like a paper and it cites like this study, go to that study and see what studies they cite, and just follow the rabbit hole back and dig a little bit deeper, because that's how you're going to find like the real data that back up what you're looking for. Anybody else?
All right. Thank you.
Awesome.